I should assure you that books that are easy to read are hard to write. So I'm going to frame our discussion today around the problems of service delivery, public service delivery, and doing good public service delivery in Africa, which is the region I know best. And the starting point is that the present model of public service delivery in Africa hasn't worked. It delivers truly extraordinarily bad outcomes. And in a moment I'm going to try and analyse why and what will be better, and how the rise of natural resource revenues in Africa is going to complicate that, and where I'm going to end up with is that localized delivery probably always was a good idea, but that the rise of resource rents probably make it a more important idea. So that's going to be the story. But just let me start by giving you just a couple of examples of how bad things are. And they're not nice examples, but until you grasp the enormity of the public service delivery failure in Africa, you don't really, you're not on the right page. So I'm just going to tell you two stories. One is very recent research evidence on the schooling system in Uganda. So this is very new. It was just presented last month to the Ugandan Minister of Finance and her team. And what it showed was, first, that the one thing that was measured was what is the average true working day of a school teacher in Uganda, in the sense of time actually teaching students. And the answer is it's 2 hours. So they're actually working 2 hours a day. And then a more troubling set of results concerns what do teachers know. So there they are teaching young children, and so maths teachers were given the test that their children have to pass, and the question was, what proportion of maths teachers could do well on this test? And the answer was 4%. And then the same with English. And the answer there was a little bit better, it was 30%. But basically, you've got a very large group of teachers in Uganda who don't show up and teach children, and when they do show up and teach children, don't know the basic material that they're supposed to be teaching them. And so the outcome cannot be other than catastrophic. Right? So that's the story of Uganda education. I take Uganda because it's one of the stars. This is one of the better countries. So everybody knows Nigeria's got problems, but let's look at the better ones. And then, so that's education. And then I'll take one story on health, which is from Zambia. And again, why Zambia? Well, actually, because Zambia is one of the better governed countries in Africa, which is why we know this story. And this story concerns antiretrovirals. And the Global Fund, a few years ago, went to Zambia and said, you've got a big AIDS problem. There's now global money for antiretrovirals. We will pay for all the antiretrovirals you need. Right? So they went to the Ministry of Health and said that. Whereupon the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health, the chief civil servant responsible, saw an opportunity. And so he set up a company to import antiretroviral drugs, which was his own company. So then he imported antiretroviral drugs and sold them at a profit to the Ministry of Health, which he was running. So this seemed to be, you know, a pretty naked conflict of interest, but it gets worse. Because the permanent secretary decided that this wasn't a profit-maximizing behavior, and profit-maximizing behavior was for his company to import fake antiretroviral drugs, which he did. Now, I was going to say, Zambia is one of the better-run countries in Africa, which is why this story eventually came to light. He was prosecuted, so we know about it. But these are just to benchmark the enormity of the public service delivery problem in Africa. As I say, these are two of the better-run countries, and we've taken a fairly typical education story and a sadly rather atrocious but not extreme health story. So, next question is, why are things like that? And I'm going to, I'm an applied Africanist, not a theorist. So forgive me, I will do terrible violence, but to the theorist. But I'm going to I'm very heavily influenced both by Roger, and I see Roger's key thrust of his analysis is basically around accountability. But also, I'm very influenced by George Akerlof, and I see George's key thrust in his book on identity economics as being about internalization of objectives. And so I'm going to be trying to use these two concepts of what's gone wrong is some mixture of a failure of accountability and a failure of internalization. And now I'm going to take a great leap and say, I think cultures differ, cultures really matter, and I'm going to try and shrink culture. Roger shrunk culture to one concept. He said, the aspect of culture which is really important is what, basically what citizens expect of their leaders. Yeah? Now, I'm going to do something which is not as drastic as saying culture is this one thing, but I'm going to shrink it to four components, and this might be crazy. So forgive me, but put yourself in my position as an applied economist talking to a bunch of theorists, right? And just be indulgent. So here's how I'm reducing culture to four concepts. And one is identities. And this is very sort of Akerlovian. And what I think of as first and foremost is what identities do. I'll tell you later where I think they come from. But I think what identities do is where they give people a set of objectives or preferences, as it were. It's to try and endogenize preferences. We know that identities matter. We can see that in a lot of behavioral studies. I mean, the one I find neatest is the framing game with Asian American women doing a maths test, that if they're primed to be Asian, they perform significantly better on the test than if they're primed to be women. So So identity, the astounding thing of all this sort of evidence is how very light priming can produce quite significant changes in behaviour. And of course, people are actually getting their identities much more robust than that. It's not just a passing wind. We've now got the Benabou and Tirol new concept of taboos is saying, well, actually, identities are investments, which then, once you've made that investment, you protect your investment with a taboo. And that's rational. So identities are going to be one thing. A second building block is going to be narratives. So if identities are giving you preferences, narratives are how ordinary people acquire causal understanding of how the world works. So I download a set of narratives, and this tells me if I do A, B will happen. Now, if we narratives are invoked in economics. So George Akerlof, in his other book, in his other work, the financial economics stuff, is all about sort of stories and the power of narratives, basically. But where narratives are really big is psychology, where we can show that the narratives that, indeed, a lot of psychology is about trying to refit people with different narratives, so that you then, as people download different narratives, their behavior changes. Third building block is norms. And norms I think of as the internalized constraints on behavior. So those are the three things. You've got identities endogenizing preferences, narratives endogenizing your understanding of how the world works, of causality, and norms endogenizing the constraints you're under. How do you get those three things? You get them from the fourth building block, which is networks. You are the member of some network, and that network delivers you a restricted choice of identities, a restricted choice of narratives, and a restricted choice of norms. And so people in different networks will adopt these different preferences, understanding the world, and norms. So networks are how people get information on the other three things. Now, having endogenized everything, we're in a total mess. So how do we get back to something that's stable in the world? And you have to, what I suggest is to think of these four things as the control variables which some higher order principle is using as the control variables. So in the case of public service delivery, there's somebody, somewhere at the top of government who needs to be using the networks to download identities, narratives, and norms which make the best job possible in that society for public service delivery. So that's how I'm currently thinking about these problems. Now let's have a look at why, applying some of these concepts, does public service delivery go so wrong in Africa at the moment? How do we get situations like Ugandan teachers and Zambian permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health? And there are two agency problems that the present system faces, both of which are characterized by dysfunctional but stable equilibrium, locally stable dysfunctional equilibrium. So one agency problem is the agency problem that citizens have with government, and the other agency problem is the problem that governments have with the public service employees. So you've got citizens have to control government, government has to control the public sector workers. What goes wrong with citizens controlling government? I won't dwell on this very much because it's kind of old hat, but both internalization and accountability go wrong. And I want to take those two building blocks that both seem to me to matter. Why does accountability go wrong? Well, Roger just gave it. I mean, as he was talking, I was thinking Nigeria, and then he said it was Nigeria, and he was quite right. And he was quite right as to what is the impediment for, say, a good governor to become a good president, and it's identity. It's that people, typically in Africa, haven't got strong national identity, but they have strong subnational identity. And so they would prefer to have a leader from their own subnational group over any leader, good or bad, from a different subnational group. And some very good evidence for that was survey evidence that my group did after the re-election of President Kibaki of Kenya. Kibaki had a first term, and he was actually not a bad president. He was a bit old, but he was a highly qualified technician who'd been pushed out by the previous President Moi and managed to come back and finally was running the country. And his first term, he did a pretty reasonable job. And then our survey was to find out at the time of the second election, his re-election, what non-Kikuyu voters thought about him. So we looked at the next tribe, the Luo, and around 50% of Luo voters thought that Kibaki had actually done a pretty decent job. Of that approximately 50%, 4% were willing to vote for him. In other words, identity just trumped assessments of performance. The one instance in Africa, well, there's two, but one instance in Africa where national identity was successfully built was Tanzania. And there's a very good paper by Ted Miguel called Tribe or Nation, which is a very nice use of a natural experiment to compare behavior in a border area of Kenya and Tanzania. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, just let me describe it for a minute because it's so neat. So on the Tanzanian side of the border, you've got villages which are multi-ethnic and villages which are single-ethnic, and the same is true on the Kenyan side. It's the same mix of people. And so Miguel looked at a classic village public good, which was a well, to see could villages cooperate to maintain a well. And in Tanzania, there was no difference between the ethnically diverse villages and the ethnically homogeneous villages. They were both able to maintain a well. And in Kenya, only the ethnically homogeneous villages could maintain a well. And that just represented the outcome of 50 years of different narratives. In Tanzania, Nyerere, the first act when Nyerere became head of the country was he stepped down for a year because he said, I've not got a country. I've got 130 tribes. And he spent a year going around all the tribal groups trying to persuade them, actually, you're Tanzanian. And then he adopted a load of strategies, a common language, Kiswahili, common education system, moving junior civil servants to make sure they didn't work in their own region. So a load of strategies to build a sense of nationhood. In Kenya, you've got exactly the opposite. It's a nice contrast because in Kenya, the president got his economic policies right, his political identity policies wrong, and Nyerere vice versa. Nyerere got his economics all screwed up. But 50 years later, you've got identity in one, national identity in one and not in the other. So that's why accountability fails at the national level. Doesn't necessarily fail at the local level, it fails at the national level. And internalization fails because the norms in Africa, the moral norms, let's think of that Zambian permanent secretary. Did he regard himself as ultimately evil? I doubt it. I doubt it. I suspect that he went to church and all the rest of it, and what he was, I think, thinking of was, I've got obligations, which I'm sure he had. I'm sure he had a big extended family, of some of which were impoverished, who were hammering on his door every day, saying, we need money. And this way he satisfied those moral obligations, and they trumped the idea that you'd be condemning many thousands of people to death, but they weren't his people. So a failure of internalization. So that's the citizen to government thing. It just in Africa doesn't work at the national level. And now we come to that second layer, which is the government has to control its employees. Now, if you think about it, that Ugandan story I told, now you could see it as a failure of accountability, and to some extent it is, that the teachers are not properly accountable either to the parents of the children or to higher forms of within the Ministry of Education. But frankly, I mean, when I think of my teachers, or you think of your teachers, why did they show up to teach us? Why did they know what they were teaching us? Was it all because of accountability? I don't think so. I think fundamentally these teachers had internalized the notion, I'm a good teacher. And having internalized that notion, I'm a good teacher, first of all, you bloody well showed up to work, and secondly, you made sure that you understood enough maths or understood enough English to be able to teach it. And so the temptation is to diagnose the problem in Uganda as a capacity problem. Teachers haven't been taught enough maths, people haven't been taught enough English. I don't think it's that. I think the lack of capacity is endogenous to a failure to internalize objectives. So that's where we stand, that neither of these agency problems is remotely being satisfied, neither government being accountable to citizens nor employees to government, and it's not just accountability, it's internalization. Now we're going to add natural resource discoveries to that. I mean, we can get directly practical. Tanzania and Uganda, Tanzania's just discovered gas, Uganda's just discovered oil. So how does that change things? First, it changes identities. Doesn't have to, but there's a very big danger of it. And the reason is that natural resources are always discovered somewhere, not everywhere. And let's take that Tanzanian example. So Tanzania is as good as it gets in Africa. You had a president who built a sense of national identity. This time last year, I was with the Tanzanian cabinet trying to advise them on their new gas discovery. And I said, what are you going to do about who owns the stuff? Meaning, where are the tax revenues going to accrue? Is it all national? Is some of it local? And the cabinet, to a man, said, oh, this is not an issue in Tanzania. Nyerere bequeathed us a sense of nationhood, and so, of course, all the gas revenues will be national. And what's more, the gas happens to be offshore, so this one's easy. Well, 6 months later, there were riots in the region off whose shore the gas was found, Mtwara. 4 people dead. What were the riots about? It's Mtwara's gas. And so even in Tanzania, natural resources have basically started to bust national identity. And so identities move more localized as you get these natural resource discoveries. Doesn't have to be like that. Another Botswana story, the first president, I was told this by the living second president just a couple of months ago, but the first president, Sir Seretse Khama, who was indeed a great man, before diamonds were discovered, he had the good sense to go round all the clan leaders. So his networks were clan leaders, and he delivered a narrative to all the clan leaders, and the narrative was this: we have got nothing. We are the poorest country in Africa. This is a landlocked desert with nothing. Can we agree that anything we do find will belong to all of us? And the clan leaders thought about it and said, yeah, that makes sense. So behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance given by a lack of geological information, you were able to do that. And what's happening in Africa now is you've got a rush of natural resource companies discovering things here and there, and that Rawlsian veil of ignorance being ripped apart before leaders have had the chance to build a sense of national identity. In September, I had the Minister of Finance and Minister of Natural Resources for Somalia here for a week, and that was their big problem. The resource extraction companies going around uncontrolled fashion in Somalia because the government doesn't yet control the territory, and they're discovering localized natural resources. They can buy off the local population, and so identity, which is still not coalesced into a sense of where Somalis, is actually going to become much more localized. So that's one effect of natural resources, to localized identities, even more than they already localized. Another effect of natural resources is to change the narrative. And there's a very dysfunctional narrative which sets in, which, for example, is already set in Tanzania, in Mtwara. I talked to the commissioner from Mtwara, and he told me what the young people in Mtwara are saying. First, they're saying, well, we're each going to get an envelope with $200 a month in it. Completely false mythology. But they said that it's summarized by the phrase, we're all rich, we don't need to work anymore. So again, a disastrous narrative, which again, Seretse Khama in Botswana managed to counter by developing a narrative across the country, which any Botswanan will repeat, which basically, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. That was the narrative he developed, which, if you think about it, is the antithesis of we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. So it can be countered, but the default option is we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. You see that in Tanzania, which discovered oil. I saw the finance minister the month after. I said, how are things? He said, it's awful. He said, the whole public sector's already gone on strike for wage rises. This was a month after the discovery. It'll be years before any revenue comes in. Nigeria established the pattern. 1994, the big increase in oil prices. 1995, the famous Udoji Pay Awards, which push wages, public sector wages up 75%. So the public sector becomes redefined as basically the oil rent receiving wage sector, rather than its role as delivering services for citizens. So when you add natural resources, you tend to make things worse. And if you look at the global evidence on this, just a couple of things that I've done. One, work on public infrastructure. And you'd expect that controlling for other things, if you're depleting natural resources, you'd have superior public infrastructure to offset it. In fact, the opposite happens. Globally, controlling for other things, level of income and so on, the more natural resource income you have, the worse your public capital stock, the lower your public capital stock. And then some work I did on whether the interaction between democracy and natural resources. And what we found was that democracy worsens growth performance with natural resources unless there are strong checks and balances. So we decompose democracy into electoral competition and checks and balances. And the message that came from that was basically, yes, democracy can work well, but only if you've got strong checks and balances. And of course, in new democracies, it's easy to do elections, elections are events where there's a strong incentive to take part in them, whereas checks and balances are the ultimate public goods. They're institutions that take a long time to build and become a reality. And so the early years of democracy, you've got electoral competition without checks and balances, and that enables the incumbents to abuse power. So now, having sketched the problems, let me now try and suggest the solutions, which by now you should recognize this bit is going to be heroic. And the solution that I've advocated is what Roger referred to last night as auxiliary public service agencies. And the idea of auxiliary public service agencies is to change the delivery, the agency problem. So instead of citizens holding government accountable and government employing workers nationally, so the employees are just a direct employee, the service delivery workers are the direct employees of the government. We split it, and we have government subcontracting with organizations, and organizations then dealing with workers. So we split that government-employee relationship. How does that potentially help? And I should say the auxiliary public service agency is the agency of government which is tasked both with contracting with outside agencies and with monitoring their performance. That's its sole function. So what government does is contract and monitor, but not provide. And the auxiliary public service agencies, you can have one, you can have 1,000. They can operate at any level, but that's the concept that is being introduced. And how does this help? Well, in all of these societies, what is most striking is that alongside these deeply dysfunctional public service delivery systems are absolutely heroic service delivery agencies which perform magnificently. The cliche example will be the mission schools. A friend of mine is governor of one of the states in Nigeria, and when he became governor, he was so frustrated that the governors have the responsibility for education in Nigeria, and he was so frustrated by the performance of education, and he felt it was unreformable. And I think that's right. I think you've got, although these are dysfunctional equilibria, they are locally stable. And so incremental reform, which we've been trying for 50 years, just doesn't work. And so his idea was, okay, I know with the trades unions and so on, I've got to leave all the money flows as they are. But I'm going to shift the management of the schools in my state from the state bureaucracy. I'm going to shift them to the churches. And he got that idea because he said, how was I educated? I was educated by teachers who knew their stuff and turned up. But they were run by the churches. And the churches are basically the organizational form at the local level which functions. So you've got local government entities which are bits of paper and appointments from the top and all that, but alongside that you've actually got functional local organizations which are the churches. And so he's handed the schools to the churches. We're at the moment trying to evaluate that to see whether it's worked.
Well, forgive me, in this area, are there multiple religions, or can it get to local churches in the same denomination?
You can get to local churches in the same denomination. not nationally, you've got everything under the sun, but within a state you've got. Thank you, Vince, for interrupting. Everybody else is welcome too as well. So how do the churches, how does a mission school work? And we've got evidence, for example, from Uganda, that the mission churches have a great paper called Working for God, which just compares the mission schools with the state-run schools. And the mission schools pay lower wages and get better results, both significantly, by significant amounts. Right? How do they do that? Well, it's a mixture, and we don't know is the answer, but it's a mixture of selection and internalization. So it's a mixture of ex-ante selection. The teachers who feel committed want to work for organizations which have an ethic of doing the job right, and ex post internalization, you join a workforce that's committed, and you absorb that. There's some evidence on that second thing. My group did a study in Ethiopia of student nurses, and unsurprisingly, they leave nurse training college, all wanting to be Florence Nightingale, and then they're sent out to clinics around Ethiopia, and 3 years later, we followed up. They didn't want to be Florence Nightingale anymore. They were at the old rackets, they steal the drugs and all the rest of it. But that's because they were junior people joining groups that are already corrupt. And so the peer norms were very dysfunctional. Whereas so at the moment, as it were, you've got a flow of young people, the normal state for young people actually, not the universal state, but the normal state is that young people actually want to believe in something. They want to have some goal other than, I just want to make a lot of money. Not universally, but young people actually have ideals. And at the moment, they're being poured that asset. It's norms without reputation, but it is ethical values, if you like. And they're being poured into organizations where they're being reprogrammed very dysfunctionally. And so Africa's losing a huge asset, which is the moral norms of its youth, which I think are there just by virtue of youth. I think it's a sort of psychological norm. And by giving the flow of money to the organizations that are functional, you would actually prevent that. You take in this flow of motivated people, and they'd stay motivated. So I don't want to say it's all internalization. Obviously, the functional organizations also do it by incentives and accountability. And I don't care how it's done. I just want the service agencies to select based on performance, monitor that performance, and scale up funding to the organizations that are delivering a good job. And then if it's done by incentives, that's fine. If it's done by internalization, that's fine. I think in practice you'll find it's done by a bit of both. Obviously, if you pay people terribly badly, internalization won't do the work.
Paul, would you favor transferring more governmental functions, local governmental functions to the churches?
Well, I'm not committed to churches. Yeah. I'm using churches as an example. Yeah. Whatever works is the answer. It could be commercial. It could be secular local government entities. Whatever works. And you need to go at this in a spirit of experimentation, which is why you need to monitor. And so I would scale the key resource of these independent service authorities is to acquire the capacities to monitor. And that monitoring has become very much more feasible because of new technology. For example, there's a new company that can send text messages for free across to every mobile phone user in Africa. And people can text back for free. It's a new resource. And so it's possible to get real-time measurement of performance. Was your teacher in school? You know? And so the scope for accountability at the level of citizen accountability has gone up enormously. And that would then flow into the Independent Service Authority so that it would actually be able to assess differences in performance. Because the workers for the organisation would not be public employees, you've got a much more credible threat of exit. Both the service authority can cut the funding, and the organisation can terminate the employment contract. And so, as well as internalisation, accountability and incentives can do a more effective job. So that's the model. Is independence, or what I used to call them independent service authorities. I've now recognised the word independent is a killer for central governments, because the last thing they want, as Roger was implying, was successful independent entities. So I now follow Roger's language of auxiliary public service agencies. That sounds altogether less threatening. I gave you one example where this has happened in a state in Nigeria. Much more recently, just this summer, so in Nigeria it was education. In South Sudan, the Sudanese Minister of Health has just decided this is a good model for South Sudan. So there's hope that this will actually start to be adopted in a few places. So that's me. Thank you.